A forgotten barn holding a nation's explosive secret. A handwritten letter signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself. One ordinary farm woman's accidental discovery that would bring the highest levels of government to her doorstep within hours. This is the remarkable true story of how Eleanor Summerfield's routine barn cleaning unearthed classified documents that would challenge the official narrative of a pivotal moment in American history, threatening powerful interests who had buried the truth for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you: the antique grandfather clock in Eleanor Summerfield's farmhouse. Kitchen struck 6:30 a.m., though she had already been awake since dawn, methodically planning her day over a steaming cup of black coffee. At 58, the widow's weathered hands showed the evidence of 3 decades working the struggling family farm in Oakridge County, a small agricultural community that most Americans couldn't locate on a map. The kitchen table was covered with unpaid bills, each one bearing increasingly urgent red stamps demanding payment. Eleanor took another sip of coffee as she studied the latest notice from Heartland Agricultural Bank. The foreclosure warning gave her 60 days to make good on the mounting debt, or the 120-acre farm that had been in her husband's family for 4 generations would be auctioned to the highest bidder. James had been gone 3 years now, taken suddenly by a heart attack while repairing the tractor on a sweltering July afternoon. She had done her best to maintain the operation alone, but consecutive seasons of drought, followed by devastating floods, had pushed the farm to financial ruin. Just 2 more months, Eleanor whispered to herself, glancing at the faded wedding, a photo hanging crookedly on the kitchen wall. They had been so young, so full of hope when they took over the farm from James's aging parents. Now, at nearly 60, Eleanor faced starting over with nothing but the small Social Security survivor's benefit that barely covered groceries, let alone a new place to live. Outside, a cool April breeze rustled through the ancient oak trees that lined the gravel driveway. The farm might be failing financially, but it remained as beautiful as it had been when Eleanor first arrived as a young bride. The rolling pastures, the weathered red barn, the creek that meandered along the eastern property line. This land was more than just her home. It was her history, her identity. Eleanor finished her coffee and moved to the window, looking out at the barn that needed more attention than she could afford to give. The roof leaked in 3 places. The paint had long ago surrendered to the elements, and one of the large double doors hung precariously from a single functioning hinge. Yet something about the old structure called to her this morning. Perhaps it was the realization that she had limited time left as its caretaker, or maybe just the practical need to begin sorting through decades of accumulated possessions before the inevitable move. "Might as well start somewhere," she muttered, pulling on her worn work boots and denim jacket. The farm cats scattered as she crossed the yard, 2 mongrel barn kittens peering cautiously from behind the rusted tractor parts that James had never gotten around to repairing. The gravel crunched beneath her boots, each step carrying the weight of impending loss. The barn door protested with a theatrical groan as Eleanor tugged it open, sending a family of startled sparrows fluttering up to the rafters. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning sunlight that penetrated the weathered roof boards. The familiar smell, a mixture of aged hay, motor oil, and generations of livestock, brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. This place held so many memories. James teaching their son Michael to milk the cows before they had to sell the dairy herd. The community square, dances they used to host on the threshing floor before rural populations dwindled and neighbors moved away for better opportunities. The quiet winter evenings she and James had spent repairing equipment, planning for spring planting, dreaming of better harvests to come. Michael had offered to help her manage the farm after James died, but Eleanor had encouraged him to stay. In Minneapolis with his young family, his career as an architectural engineer was just taking off, and the farm offered nothing but hard work and financial struggle. She had promised to let him know if things became unmanageable, but maternal pride had prevented her from admitting the truth, that she was drowning in debt and facing homelessness at an age when most people were settling into comfortable retirement. Eleanor sighed and began the overwhelming task of sorting through decades of accumulated farm implements, furniture relegated to storage, boxes of old clothes, and the miscellaneous debris that collects when families occupy the same space for generations. She worked methodically, creating piles for the charity shop in town, items Michael might want, and things destined for the dump. By mid-morning, she had cleared a path to the back wall where several ancient pieces of furniture had been stored and forgotten. An oak roll-top desk, its finish dulled by years of dust, caught her attention. Eleanor vaguely remembered James mentioning it had belonged to his grandfather, who had served as the county clerk back in the 1940s. The desk had been moved to the barn during a kitchen renovation 30 years ago and somehow never made its way back into the house. Eleanor ran her hand over the curved top, leaving finger trails in the dust. The craftsmanship was impressive, with intricate carvings and dovetailed joints that spoke of an era when furniture was built to last generations. She tried the roll-top, but decades of disuse had caused the wood to swell, jamming the mechanism. Eleanor retrieved a can of penetrating oil from James's workbench and carefully applied it to the tracks, working the top gently back and forth until it reluctantly began to move. With a final push, the top rolled up with a satisfying thunk, revealing a series of small drawers, pigeonholes, and a writing surface covered in faded green leather. Most of the cubbyholes contained what one might expect: old receipts for seed purchases, tax documents from the 1950s, a fountain pen that had long ago dried up, and various metal paper fasteners that had gone rusty with age. Eleanor worked through each drawer systematically, finding little of interest or value until she reached a small drawer tucked beneath the writing surface, almost invisible unless one knew to look for it. Preparing and narrating this story took a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drawer stuck at first, resistant to her tugging. When it finally released, the unexpected force nearly sent Eleanor tumbling backward. Inside lay a single item, a leather portfolio tied with a faded red ribbon, its surface cracked with age, but still supple. With careful fingers, Eleanor undid the simple knot and opened the portfolio. Inside was a collection of papers, typewritten, documents, handwritten notes, and several black and white photographs paper-clipped together. The first document bore an official letterhead, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the date, November 23rd, 1963. Eleanor's breath caught as she scanned the first paragraph, addressed to William Summerfield, James's grandfather. Your immediate assistance in this matter of national security is required. The enclosed witness statements regarding events observed in Dallas on November 22nd must remain sealed and unreported through official channels. The stability of the nation during this period of transition requires absolute discretion. The letter was signed with a flowing signature, J. Edgar Hoover, Director. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she turned to the next pages. Detailed statements from 3 different witnesses to the Kennedy assassination, each offering accounts that contradicted the official narrative that would later emerge from the Warren Commission. The statements mentioned multiple gunshots from different locations, suspicious men on the grassy knoll, and details about security positioning that had been altered last minute. Most disturbing were the handwritten notes from Hoover himself, in the margins, indicating which witnesses should be redirected and which details were to be permanently excluded from official record. The photographs showed angles of Dealey Plaza that Eleanor had never seen published, including clear images of individuals in locations that official reports had claimed were unoccupied during the assassination. The final page was a sworn affidavit, signed by William Summerfield, promising absolute secrecy regarding the documents in his possession and acknowledging that breaking this oath would constitute treason against the United States. Eleanor sat back on her heels, dust swirling around her in the beam of sunlight streaming through the barn window. The implications of what she held were staggering. William Summerfield had been county clerk during a time when local officials sometimes assisted federal investigations in rural areas. Somehow, he had ended up with copies of documents that directly contradicted the official Kennedy assassination narrative. Documents signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself, indicating a coordinated effort to control which witness testimonies would be included in the official record. For several minutes, Eleanor simply stared at the portfolio, unsure what to do. These papers were nearly 60 years old, but they contained explosive allegations about one of the most scrutinized moments in American history. Were they authentic? If so, why had William Summerfield hidden them in his desk rather than destroying them as presumably ordered? And most pressingly, what should she do with them now? Eleanor carefully returned the documents to the portfolio and carried it to the house, her mind racing with questions. Her first instinct was to call Michael, but she hesitated. Her son had a government security clearance for his work on municipal infrastructure projects. Involving him with potentially classified historical documents might jeopardize his career. Instead, she called the one person in Oakridge County she truly trusted with sensitive matters, Dr. Margaret Holloway, the retired history professor who had taught at the State University for 40 years before returning to her hometown. Margaret had written extensively on American political history and would know if these documents were significant or merely elaborate forgeries. "Eleanor, this is unexpected," Margaret answered on the third ring. "How are things at the farm?" "Margaret, I found something in the barn that I think you should see," Eleanor said, keeping her explanation deliberately vague. "Are you available this afternoon?" Something in Eleanor's tone must have communicated the urgency, because Margaret agreed to come right away. While waiting, Eleanor photographed each document with her outdated smartphone, creating a digital backup of the portfolio's contents. Some instinct told her this precaution might prove necessary. Dr. Holloway arrived 90 minutes later, her ancient Volvo raising a cloud of dust as it came up the driveway. At 72, Margaret remained sharp-minded and energetic, her silver hair cut in a practical bob that framed intelligent eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. "You sounded mysterious on the phone," Margaret said, as Eleanor led her to the kitchen table where the portfolio lay. "What's this about?" Rather than explaining, Eleanor simply gestured to the documents. "I found these hidden in my husband's grandfather's desk. I'd like your opinion on whether they're authentic." Margaret's expression transformed as she examined the contents, her academic detachment giving way to visible shock as she turned each page. "Where did you say you found these?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "In a hidden drawer in William Summerfield's desk. It's been sitting in our barn for decades." Margaret looked up, her face pale. "Eleanor, if these are authentic, and they certainly appear to be, you're holding evidence that directly contradicts the Warren Commission's findings on the Kennedy assassination. These witness statements were never included in the official record, so they could be important." Margaret's laugh held no humor. "Important is an understatement. This is J. Edgar Hoover's signature on FBI letterhead, explicitly directing the suppression of witness testimony. The historical significance is, well, extraordinary doesn't begin to cover it." Eleanor explained her concerns about involving Michael, and Margaret agreed that caution was warranted. These documents raise serious questions about one of the most controversial events in American history. If authentic, various institutions would have strong interests in either publicizing or burying them, depending on their agendas. "What should I do with them?" Eleanor asked. "Let me make a few calls to colleagues who specialize in document authentication," Margaret suggested. "No details about what we've found, just inquiries about the proper channels for evaluating potentially significant historical documents. In the meantime, you should—" She was interrupted by the sound of vehicles coming up the driveway. Not one, but several, judging by the noise. Eleanor moved to the window and felt her heart skip as 3 black SUVs with government plates pulled to a stop near the porch. Men in suits emerged from the vehicles, their movements precise and coordinated. "Were you followed?" Eleanor asked, turning to Margaret with alarm. The historian shook her head, looking equally confused. "I told no one where I was going. I don't understand how anyone could know about this already." The firm knock on the front door came seconds later. With a sense of unreality, Eleanor opened it to find a tall man in an impeccable suit, flanked by 4 others in similar attire, all wearing discreet earpieces. "Mrs. Eleanor Summerfield?" the man asked, his tone professionally neutral. "Yes," she answered, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm Deputy Director Carson with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have reason to believe you may have come into possession of classified government documents. I need to speak with you immediately." Eleanor's mind raced. She had discovered the documents mere hours ago and had told only one person. How could the FBI possibly know about them already? And not just any FBI representatives, but a deputy director himself, appearing at her remote farmhouse with an entourage of agents. "May I see some identification?" she asked, stalling for time. The man produced credentials that confirmed his identity as FBI Deputy Director Thomas Carson. "Mrs. Summerfield, this is a matter of national security. May we come in?" Eleanor glanced at Margaret, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Of course," she said, stepping back from the doorway, "though I'm not sure what classified documents you think I might have." As the agents entered her modest farmhouse, Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. After years of fighting to save her farm from financial disaster, this surreal development seemed almost fitting, one final extraordinary chapter before she lost her home for good. What she couldn't possibly know in that moment was that the documents she'd discovered in an old desk would not only change her life, but would force a reckoning with a historical narrative that powerful people had worked for decades to control. Deputy Director Carson declined Eleanor's offer of coffee. His attention focused entirely on the portfolio that lay on the kitchen table. "Are these the documents you discovered this morning, Mrs. Summerfield?" The specificity of his question confirmed Eleanor's suspicion that her farm was being monitored somehow. "Yes," she answered honestly, seeing no benefit in denial. "I found them while cleaning out the barn. They belonged to my husband's grandfather." "And you are?" Carson asked, turning to Margaret. "Dr. Margaret Holloway, retired professor of American history from the State University. Mrs. Summerfield asked for my opinion on the historical significance of the documents." Carson nodded, as if this explained everything. "Mrs. Summerfield, those documents contain information that remains classified under national security protocols. I'm going to have to ask you to turn them over to me immediately." Margaret interjected, her academic authority evident in her tone. "Deputy Director, these documents are over 50 years old and appear to contain evidence of potential impropriety in a historical investigation. On what grounds do they remain classified?" Carson's expression remained impassive. "Executive Order 13526 allows for continued classification of materials that would cause serious damage to national security if disclosed. These documents fall within that category." "With all due respect," Margaret countered, "the Kennedy assassination has been investigated, documented, and debated for nearly 60 years. What possible damage to national security could these witness statements cause now? That determination is not yours to make, Dr. Holloway, Carson replied smoothly. Mrs. Summerfield, please understand the seriousness of this situation. Those documents must be surrendered to federal custody immediately. Eleanor felt a surge of unexpected defiance. This farm, her home for 30 years, was slipping away from her. These documents, potentially historically significant, had been preserved by her husband's family for generations. They represented perhaps the only meaningful legacy she had left. I understand these might be sensitive, she said carefully, but they've been in my family's possession for decades. Don't I have some rights regarding their disposition? Shouldn't there be a proper process for evaluating their historical significance versus any security concerns? Carson's professional demeanor slipped slightly, revealing a flash of impatience. Mrs. Summerfield, I don't think you appreciate the gravity of this situation. These documents contain information that could undermine public trust in foundational government institutions. We're prepared to obtain a national security warrant if necessary, but I strongly advise cooperation. One of the other agents moved subtly toward the portfolio on the table, but Margaret shifted position, placing herself between the agent and the documents. The tension in the room escalated palpably. Perhaps we could reach a compromise, Eleanor suggested, maintaining a calm she didn't entirely feel. What if the documents were placed with the National Archives or a university research library, with appropriate restrictions but eventual public access? That's not possible, Carson stated flatly. These materials require secure handling by authorized personnel only. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching, this one moving faster than the government SUVs had. Through the window, Eleanor saw a familiar pickup truck skid to a stop behind the FBI vehicles. Her son Michael jumped out, followed by a woman Eleanor didn't recognize. "Your son?" Carson asked, his tone suggesting this development was unexpected. "Even to the FBI," Eleanor nodded, moving toward the door as Michael bounded up the porch steps. He burst into the house, tension evident in every line of his body. "Mom, are you okay? What's going on?" His eyes widened at the sight of the FBI agents filling the small farmhouse kitchen. "Michael, how did you know to come?" Eleanor asked, genuinely confused. "Professor Holloway's secretary called me, said the professor had rushed off to your farm after receiving a cryptic phone call, and she was worried." He turned to the woman who had accompanied him. "This is Julia Winters. She's an attorney with the Freedom of Information Project. When I told her government vehicles were at your farm, she offered to come along." The woman stepped forward, her professional demeanor a match for Deputy Director Carson's. "I understand you've discovered documents related to the Kennedy assassination, Mrs. Summerfield. I should inform everyone present that my organization has already filed emergency preservation orders with the federal court regarding any historical documents found on this property." Carson's expression hardened. "That's impossible. You couldn't have known about these documents in time to file any orders." Julia smiled thinly. "We've been monitoring unusual federal movement patterns as part of our transparency project. When we observed a deputy FBI director and a tactical team deploying to a private farm in Oakridge County with no active investigations in the area, we took precautionary measures. The judge was quite interested in why such high-level resources were being allocated to visit a widow's farm." Eleanor watched this exchange with growing amazement. The quiet farm that had seen little excitement beyond the occasional loose cow had suddenly become the center of what felt like a high-stakes political thriller. More importantly, she was no longer facing the federal government alone. "Mrs. Summerfield has rights," Julia continued, addressing Carson directly. Any historical documents in private possession are subject to proper legal processes, not unilateral seizure. If these materials have historical significance, there are established protocols for handling them that balance security concerns with historical preservation. Carson seemed to reassess the situation, his gaze moving from Julia to Michael to the document still sitting on Eleanor's kitchen table. After a moment of tense silence, he spoke with measured precision. "We are prepared to follow appropriate procedures, but those documents cannot leave federal custody. They contain sensitive information that requires secure handling." "Then let's establish a proper chain of custody," Julia proposed. "The documents can be placed in a secure federal facility, but with independent verification of their contents, proper authentication processes, and a clear timeline for declassification review." As the lawyers began negotiating terms, Eleanor found herself standing beside her son, watching this surreal scene unfold in her farmhouse kitchen. "I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your doorstep," she said quietly. Michael squeezed her shoulder. "Mom, what's happening here is important. Whatever you found must be significant for this kind of response." He paused, studying her face. "But that's not all that's going on, is it? What haven't you told me about the farm?" The perceptiveness of her son's question brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. "I was going to tell you after I'd sorted things out," she admitted. "The bank is foreclosing. I have 60 days left." Michael's expression shifted from concern to determination. "Why didn't you say something sooner? We could have worked something out." "You have your own family to worry about, your own life." "You are my family too," he insisted. "We'll figure this out together." As Eleanor watched the continued negotiations between the federal agents and Julia Winters, something occurred to her, something that might address both the immediate crisis over the documents and her personal financial disaster. The documents clearly held significant historical value. Perhaps that value could be leveraged not just for historical truth, but for her own survival as well. She stepped forward, interrupting the ongoing discussion. "I have a proposal," Eleanor said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'm willing to cooperate fully with a proper authentication and preservation process for these documents, but I want something in return." All eyes turned to her, expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. "This farm has been in my family for generations," Eleanor continued. "It's currently facing foreclosure. In exchange for my cooperation and the documents, I want assistance, securing the farm's future, either through direct purchase at fair market value or through a historical designation that would include preservation funding." Carson looked taken aback by this unexpected negotiating position. "Mrs. Summerfield, that's not how these matters are typically handled." "These aren't typical circumstances," she countered. "These documents have been protected by my family for over 50 years. That counts for something." Julia Winters nodded approvingly. "Actually, there are precedents for compensating individuals who turn over historically significant materials, and if these documents indicate what I suspect, they might. Establishing this property as a historic site related to their discovery would be entirely appropriate." As the conversation shifted to the possibilities of historical preservation grants and potential National Register designation for the farm, Eleanor felt a strange sense of hope beginning to take root. The documents she had discovered might not only reveal important historical truths, but could potentially save the home she loved from foreclosure. What she couldn't know in that moment was that the modest farmhouse kitchen in which they stood would soon become the starting point for a new chapter in American historical understanding, one that would draw scholars, journalists, and ordinary Citizens from across the country transforming her struggling farm into something she had never imagined possible. A center for historical transparency and rural preservation. The simple woman who had begun that April morning, believing she was counting down the final days on her family farm, had unwittingly stumbled upon something that would not only secure her own future, but would challenge an entire nation to reconsider its understanding of a pivotal moment in its history. As Eleanor watched the formal document custody process begin, she realized that sometimes salvation arrives in the most unexpected forms, not as the answer we're seeking, but as the question we never thought to ask. By the time Deputy Director Carson and his team departed Eleanor's farmhouse, the afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the distant ridgeline, casting long shadows across the weathered barn that had concealed its secret for so many decades. The documents had been carefully placed in specialized evidence containers, each page photographed, numbered, and logged in the presence of Julia Winters, who insisted on documenting every aspect of the transfer. The kitchen table, that normally held nothing more exciting than Eleanor's morning coffee and the farm's account books, had temporarily served as an impromptu processing station for materials that might rewrite a critical chapter of American history. "We've established a solid legal framework," Julia explained, as they watched the government vehicles disappear down the gravel driveway. "The FBI has physical custody for authentication and preservation, but they've acknowledged your ownership rights and our oversight of the process. Most importantly, they've agreed to an independent review panel that includes historians without government security clearances." Eleanor nodded, still processing the whirlwind events of the day. Just hours ago, she had been a struggling widow facing foreclosure, anonymously sorting through barn debris. Now she stood at the center of what promised to be a significant historical revelation, with experts in constitutional law, government transparency, and Kennedy assassination research suddenly invested in her family farm. "What happens now?" she asked, turning to Julia and Margaret, who had remained steadfastly by her side throughout the negotiations. "Now," Margaret said with a smile that conveyed both academic excitement and personal concern, "you prepare for the storm. Once word gets out about what you've found, and it will, no matter how the FBI tries to control the narrative, your quiet life is going to change dramatically." Michael, who had been making calls from the porch, rejoined them in the kitchen. "I've spoken with my firm's real estate division. They're already looking into historical preservation grants and National Register applications. If the documents prove as significant as they appear, we might be able to secure emergency funding to halt the foreclosure proceedings." Eleanor felt a conflicting mixture of hope and apprehension. The possibility of saving the farm kindled a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years, but the thought of public attention and controversy brought equal measures of dread. She had spent her entire adult life in the comfortable anonymity of rural existence, her most public role being occasional volunteer work at the county fair's pie judging contest. "I never wanted to be at the center of anything," she admitted, sinking into her familiar kitchen chair. "I just wanted to keep the farm going, to honor what James and his family built here." Margaret sat beside her, covering Eleanor's weathered hand with her own. "Sometimes history chooses us, Eleanor. Your husband's grandfather made a choice all those years ago. He could have destroyed those documents as instructed, but instead he preserved them. Perhaps he knew someday they would matter. Or perhaps he just couldn't bring himself to destroy something important," Eleanor suggested, thinking of James's similar tendency to preserve everything from antique farm implements to his father's college essays. The Summerfield men never threw anything away if they thought it might have value someday. "Whatever his reasons," Julia interjected, her lawyer's precision balanced by unexpected warmth, His choice has created an opportunity not just for historical truth, but for the preservation of this farm. Sometimes justice works in roundabout ways. As evening approached, the unexpected visitors departed one by one. Julia to file additional legal paperwork, Margaret to make discreet inquiries among trusted historical colleagues, and Michael to collect overnight necessities, insisting he would return to stay at the farm until the situation stabilized. Eleanor found herself alone for the first time since discovering the portfolio, the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old farmhouse now seeming to carry new significance. She prepared a simple dinner from the garden vegetables she had preserved last fall, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind processed the day's revelations. The documents had been genuine enough to bring an FBI deputy director to her door within hours of their discovery. Their contents clearly challenged the official narrative of an event that had shaped American consciousness for generations. And, somehow, improbably, these historical facts might be the key to saving the family farm she had resigned herself to losing. As Eleanor ate at the kitchen table, surrounded by empty chairs that had just hours ago seated government agents and legal advocates, she allowed herself to acknowledge something she had been suppressing for months. She was exhausted, not just physically tired from the constant struggle to maintain the farm single-handed, but soul-weary from fighting a losing battle against economic forces beyond her control. For the first time since James's death, she permitted herself to imagine a different future, one where the farm survived, but perhaps with a new purpose. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Expecting Michael's return, Eleanor was surprised to see an unfamiliar sedan parking beside her weathered pickup truck. A moment later, a sharp knock sounded at the door. The man who stood on her porch was in his 70s, distinguished-looking, with silver hair and the careful posture of someone accustomed to formal environments. "Mrs. Summerfield, my name is Richard Harrington. I served as a Justice Department analyst during the Kennedy administration. I believe you've found something that I've been seeking for a very long time." Eleanor regarded him warily, the day's events having rapidly developed her skepticism. "How did you know about the documents? The FBI only left a few hours ago." Harrington's smile held a mixture of weariness and vindication. "Mrs. Summerfield, when a deputy director of the FBI suddenly deploys to a rural farm with a tactical team, certain people take notice. People who have spent decades monitoring unusual government activities related to the Kennedy assassination. May I come in? I promise I'm not here to take anything from you. Quite the opposite, in fact." Against her better judgment, Eleanor allowed him inside, though she left the door ajar and kept her cell phone in her pocket. "I don't have the documents anymore. The FBI has taken them for authentication." "I expected as much," Harrington said, settling into a kitchen chair at her invitation. "But they haven't taken your memory of what you saw, or your rights as the discoverer of those materials. That's why I'm here. The documents you found are only part of a larger historical record that's been strategically suppressed. I believe I can help provide context that will strengthen your position." Eleanor studied him closely. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Because I've spent 50 years trying to uncover the complete truth about Dallas," Harrington replied, his voice taking on an intensity that transformed his genteel exterior. "I was young, just 28, working as a document analyst when it happened. I saw reports cross my desk in the chaotic days afterward, reports that contradicted what would become the official narrative. I flagged inconsistencies, raised questions through proper channels. 2 weeks later, I was reassigned to a basement office analyzing agricultural trade disputes." He paused, the weight of decades evident in his expression. "I knew then that something larger was happening, something that went beyond a lone gunman's actions. I've spent my entire adult life trying to piece together the scattered evidence that was systematically removed from the official record. The documents you found in William Summerfield's desk may be the most significant validation yet of what some of us have long suspected, that J. Edgar Hoover personally directed the shaping of the Warren Commission's findings by controlling which witness testimonies were included and which were buried. Eleanor poured coffee for them both, finding Harrington's account compelling despite her inclination toward caution. Even if that's true, why would it still matter today? Everyone involved is likely dead by now. It matters, Harrington said, emphatically, because the precedent established then has shaped how our government functions in times of crisis ever since. The mechanisms created to control the Kennedy narrative became templates for managing future controversies. More importantly, a democracy can only function properly when its citizens have access to historical truth, however uncomfortable that truth might be. Their conversation continued as darkness fell across the farm. Harrington shared insights from his decades of research, connecting the materials Eleanor had discovered to other documented irregularities in the official investigation. He explained the broader historical context of Cold War tensions, institutional power struggles between the FBI and CIA, and the political imperatives that might have motivated the suppression of certain witness accounts. When Michael returned and found them deep in conversation, his initial alarm gave way to fascination as Harrington's expertise became evident. By the time Margaret called to check in, they had moved to the living room, spreading out Michael's laptop and Harrington's meticulously organized research files across the coffee table. Eleanor, Margaret said when updated about their visitor, Richard Harrington is considered the dean of independent Kennedy researchers. If he's there in person, this is even bigger than I initially thought. The next morning brought further evidence of how rapidly Eleanor's discovery was rippling through specialized circles. Julia Winters arrived shortly after breakfast, accompanied by a digital archiving expert who specialized in creating secure, authenticated copies of sensitive historical materials. By mid-morning, a respected document authenticator from the state university had joined them, having been quietly contacted by Margaret. The FBI will conduct their own authentication process, Julia explained, but we need independent verification from experts without government affiliations. This creates important checks and balances in how the information is processed and eventually presented to the public. Eleanor watched with growing amazement as her farmhouse transformed into an impromptu research headquarters. The dining room table became the domain of the authentication expert, who examined Eleanor's photographs of the documents with specialized equipment. The living room hosted a growing timeline being assembled by Harrington and Margaret, connecting the newly discovered materials to previously known evidence. Michael and Julia occupied the kitchen, navigating the complex legal terrain of historical preservation designations and emergency funding applications. Throughout the day, more visitors arrived, carefully vetted colleagues of Margaret and Harrington, each bringing specialized knowledge or resources. A retired FBI agent who had spent decades privately investigating bureau mishandling of crucial evidence, a forensic linguistics expert who could analyze Hoover's handwritten marginalia, a Kennedy Library archivist who had taken a sudden, personal day to view evidence that might complement the official collections. By afternoon, a news van from the local affiliate appeared at the end of the driveway, its presence a harbinger of the media attention to come. Julia intercepted the reporters before they could approach the house, providing a carefully worded statement that acknowledged a potentially significant historical discovery while emphasizing that proper authentication processes were underway. "It's starting," Margaret observed from the window as Julia handled the reporters. "Once the story breaks nationally, everything changes." Are you prepared for that, Eleanor? The question gave her pause. Eleanor Summerfield had lived her entire adult life in relative anonymity, the rhythms of her days dictated by seasons and farm necessities rather than public attention. The prospect of becoming even temporarily newsworthy was disorienting. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I'd never sought any of this. I was just cleaning out the barn." Sometimes the most significant contributions to history come from ordinary people who weren't seeking importance, Margaret replied. Your father-in-law's decision to preserve those documents rather than destroy them was a quiet act of historical conscience. Your discovery has given his choice meaning. As evening approached, Eleanor stepped outside, needing a moment of solitude amid the growing activity. The familiar landscape of the farm, the rolling pastures, the ancient oak trees, the weathered barn that had yielded such an unexpected discovery, provided a grounding counterpoint to the day's developments. This land had witnessed generations of Summerfields living, working, and passing on, each leaving their mark in ways visible and invisible. She walked to the old barn, its interior now partially cleared from her previous day's efforts. The roll-top desk stood where she had left it, its secret compartment empty, but somehow still significant. Eleanor ran her fingers over the aged wood, wondering about William Summerfield's thoughts as he hid those explosive documents inside, defying direct orders from one of the most powerful men in America. "I never knew you," she whispered to the long-deceased county clerk, "but I think I understand you now. You couldn't bring yourself to destroy historical truth, even when ordered to do so. You found a middle path, neither exposing yourself to danger by speaking out nor complying fully with an order you found troubling." The sound of an approaching vehicle drew Eleanor back to the present moment. Through the barn door she saw an unmarked black sedan pulling up beside the growing collection of cars in her driveway. The man who emerged moved with the unmistakable precision of long military or law enforcement training, his assessment of the surroundings immediate and comprehensive. Eleanor stepped out of the barn, suddenly conscious of being alone at some distance from the house where others were gathered. The man spotted her immediately, changing course to approach her directly rather than continuing to the farmhouse. "Mrs. Summerfield," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the early evening air. "My name is Director Thomas Rayburn, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I was hoping we might speak privately." Eleanor felt a surge of apprehension. Deputy Director Carson's visit the previous day had been unexpected, but at least accompanied by a clear official purpose. This unannounced arrival by the FBI's actual director, without accompanying agents or visible security, struck her as highly unusual. "My son and legal counsel are in the house," she replied, standing her ground rather than moving toward him. "I'm aware," Rayburn said, stopping at a respectful distance. "That's why I hope to speak with you alone first. Some matters are better discussed directly, without the immediate complications of lawyers and witnesses." Eleanor considered her options. Refusing to speak with him would be within her rights, but might escalate tensions at a delicate moment in the authentication process. Agreeing to a private conversation carried its own risks, but might provide insight into exactly why these decades-old documents had triggered such high-level attention. "We can talk by the oak tree," she decided, indicating a massive tree with a bench beneath it, visible from the house windows, but far enough away for private conversation. "It's a lovely evening to be outdoors." If Rayburn recognized her strategic choice of location, private but observable, he gave no indication, simply nodding and falling into step beside her as they walked toward the ancient oak. Unlike Carson's businesslike efficiency, Rayburn projected a different quality, the patient focus of someone accustomed to navigating complex human situations rather than merely enforcing protocols. "This is a beautiful property, Mrs. Summerfield," he observed as they settled on the bench. "How long has it been in your family?" "My husband's family has owned it for 4 generations," Eleanor replied, unwilling to engage in extended pleasantries. "But I suspect you didn't come here to discuss agricultural heritage." Rayburn acknowledged this with a slight smile. Direct and perceptive. Good qualities. He turned slightly to face her more fully. "Mrs. Summerfield, the documents you discovered have created a significant situation for several government institutions, including mine. Before this escalates further, I wanted to speak with you personally, one human being to another, about the broader implications." "The implications of historical evidence that J. Edgar Hoover deliberately shaped the Kennedy assassination investigation?" Eleanor asked, deciding that directness was her best approach. "The implications of releasing decades-old materials without proper historical context," Rayburn countered smoothly. "History is rarely as straightforward as a collection of documents might suggest. The Kennedy assassination occurred during an extraordinarily tense period in the Cold War. Certain investigative decisions that might seem questionable in isolation made more sense within the full geopolitical context of the time." Eleanor studied him carefully. "Are you suggesting the documents shouldn't be made public?" "I'm suggesting that historical truth is served not just by what is revealed, but by how it's contextualized," Rayburn replied. "The Bureau is prepared to be extraordinarily accommodating regarding your situation, Mrs. Summerfield. The financial difficulties with your farm, your desire for historical preservation, these are concerns we can address generously while ensuring the documents receive proper historical framing when eventually released." The careful phrasing clarified his actual proposal: financial compensation and farm preservation in exchange for allowing the FBI to control how and when the documents would be shared with the public, if ever. "Director Rayburn," Eleanor said, after a thoughtful pause, "I spent 30 years partnered with a man who valued straightforward dealing above all else. James could forgive almost any mistake, but he had no patience for people who wouldn't simply say what they meant. So let me be clear. Are you offering to solve my financial problems in exchange for allowing the FBI to potentially bury these documents again?" Rayburn's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested he appreciated her directness, even if it complicated his mission. "I'm offering a solution that addresses your personal concerns, while allowing for responsible management of sensitive historical materials. The documents will be preserved and studied by appropriate historians with proper security clearances. Their insights will eventually inform a more complete historical understanding." "Eventually," Eleanor repeated, the single word carrying her skepticism. "History requires perspective, Mrs. Summerfield. Premature releases of context-free materials can distort rather than clarify." Eleanor gazed out across the farm that had been her home for 3 decades, the land that had supported generations of Summerfields before her. The weathered buildings, the fertile fields, the sense of continuity and purpose, all of it could be secured with a single word of agreement. The temptation was powerful, particularly after years of financial struggle and the looming reality of foreclosure. Yet something in her rebelled against Rayburn's careful proposal. Perhaps it was the memory of William Summerfield, who couldn't bring himself to destroy historical evidence, even when ordered by J. Edgar Hoover himself. Perhaps it was James's uncompromising commitment to straightforward dealing. Or perhaps it was simply the Midwestern farmer's instinctive wariness of deals that seemed too conveniently beneficial. "Director Rayburn," she said finally, "I appreciate your coming here personally. It speaks to the significance of what was found in that barn. But I don't think I can accept your offer, generous as it might be. Those documents were preserved for a reason. After 50 years, perhaps they deserve to speak for themselves, whatever they might say." Rayburn studied her with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "Most people in your financial situation would consider this opportunity providential, Mrs. Summerfield. May I ask what's driving your decision?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I suppose it comes down to respect. Respect for William Summerfield's choice to preserve those documents despite the risks, respect for the historical record itself, and respect for the public's right to understand our shared history, however complicated it might be." She smiled slightly. "And perhaps a farmer's stubborn belief that sunlight usually helps things grow stronger, even if it sometimes reveals imperfections." The FBI director nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he had expected this outcome, despite his efforts. "You've given this considerable thought. I respect your position, even if I believe a more measured approach would better serve the historical record." He rose from the bench. "I should warn you that once this story breaks nationally, your life will change dramatically. The Kennedy assassination remains one of the most contested historical events in American memory. You will be approached by conspiracy theorists, media personalities, academic researchers, and government representatives, all with their own agendas." "I'm beginning to understand that," Eleanor acknowledged, standing as well. "Fortunately, I seem to have found some trustworthy advisors to help navigate what's coming." As they walked back toward the house, where curious faces had appeared, at windows tracking their interaction, Rayburn made one final observation. "You know, Mrs. Summerfield, the most significant historical developments often come not from grand governmental actions, but from the quiet decisions of ordinary individuals following their conscience. Whatever happens next, you've certainly ensured that William Summerfield's choice will not go unrecognized." The FBI director departed as discreetly as he had arrived, leaving Eleanor to rejoin the growing research team in her farmhouse. As she explained the nature of Rayburn's unexpected visit, she noticed something had shifted in how the others regarded her. A new respect in their expressions, an acknowledgement that this unassuming farmwoman had just held firm in a direct conversation with one of the most powerful figures in American law enforcement. "So what happens now?" she asked, looking around at the historians, lawyers, and researchers who had converged on her rural kitchen. "Now," Julia said with a determined smile, "we prepare for tomorrow's headlines. By this time tomorrow, Eleanor Summerfield will no longer be just a struggling widow facing foreclosure. You'll be the farm owner who found evidence that might rewrite a pivotal chapter in American history. Everything changes for the documents, for this farm, and most certainly for you." As the team returned to their various tasks with renewed energy, Eleanor stepped onto the porch, watching the last light of day fading over her fields. The farm that had seemed destined for auction just 24 hours earlier now hummed with purpose and possibility. The barn that had held its secret for decades stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, a reminder that the past is never truly finished, merely waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. What Eleanor Summerfield could not yet fully comprehend was how completely her life would transform in the coming days. How her simple act of cleaning out a forgotten desk would challenge established historical narratives, create new opportunities for rural historic preservation, and ultimately offer her a purpose that transcended the daily struggle to maintain the family farm. The documents hidden by William Summerfield had waited patiently for decades, their revelations suspended in time until the precise moment when they might emerge to shed new light on the past while securing the future of the land they had occupied for so long. Eleanor awoke before dawn the next morning, her body still adhering to the farmer's schedule ingrained over decades, despite the extraordinary circumstances that now surrounded her. For a brief, disorienting moment, the world felt normal. The familiar creaks of the old farmhouse, the distant lowing of the neighbor's cattle, the first birdsong announcing the approaching day. Then reality rushed back as she registered the sound of voices already murmuring downstairs, the glow of computer screens visible through her bedroom door, the knowledge that nothing about her life remained ordinary. She dressed simply in well-worn jeans and one of James's old flannel shirts that she had never been able to part with, drawing comfort from its faded softness. In the bathroom mirror, Eleanor confronted her reflection, the silver-streaked hair, the lines etched by decades of sun and wind, the clear eyes that had witnessed so much change on this land. The face looking back at her belonged to a woman who had never sought attention or acclaim, who had built her identity around stewardship and perseverance rather than recognition. "You're still you," she whispered to her reflection, "no matter what happens next." Downstairs, the research team had already resumed work, fueled by thermoses of coffee and the unique energy that comes from pursuing historical truth. Julia Winters was engaged in an intense phone conversation with colleagues in Washington, negotiating terms for the document authentication process. Richard Harrington and Margaret Holloway sat at the dining room table, cross-referencing the photographs Eleanor had taken with existing Kennedy assassination records. Michael had converted the small den into a makeshift media response center, drafting statements and creating a system for filtering the inquiries that would inevitably flood in once the story broke. "Mom," Michael said, spotting her descent on the stairs, "you should see this." He handed her the morning newspaper, which featured a small but prominent article on the front page. Historical Kennedy documents discovered on local farm. The piece was factually sparse, but concluded with a statement that federal officials and independent historians were working to authenticate materials that might significantly enhance our understanding of the Kennedy assassination investigation. "It's just the beginning," Michael explained. "The major outlets are picking it up now. Julia's been fielding calls since 5 a.m. Eleanor accepted a cup of coffee from Margaret, the familiar ritual somewhat grounding amid the growing commotion. How did they get the story so quickly? In situations involving high-level government attention, there are always strategic leaks, Julia explained, temporarily muting her phone call. Both sides use media coverage to strengthen their position. The FBI likely released basic information to establish official involvement, while our contacts provided context about independent oversight to ensure transparency. Before Eleanor could respond, a distinctive electronic chime signaled an incoming video call on Michael's laptop. He glanced at the screen, his expression registering surprise. "It's Grayson Emmett from the National Historical Foundation," he explained, looking to Julia for guidance. The attorney nodded her approval. "The foundation is respected for its independence. This could be significant support." Michael accepted the call, angling the screen so Eleanor could participate. The distinguished face that appeared belonged to a man in his 60s with thoughtful eyes behind scholarly glasses. "Mrs. Summerfield, Grayson Emmett, Executive Director of the National Historical Foundation. I apologize for the early hour, but given developments reported this morning, timing is critical." Eleanor moved into frame, acutely conscious of her simple appearance compared to Emmett's tailored blazer and polished demeanor. "Good morning, Mr. Emmett. I'm still adjusting to all of this attention." "Understandable," Emmett replied with a warm smile that softened his academic formality. Few people experience the transition from private citizen to historical figure quite so abruptly. "I'm calling because the Foundation has a particular interest in your discovery and its preservation. We've been monitoring government handling of historically significant materials for over 40 years, with special focus on Kennedy assassination records." Eleanor listened as Emmett outlined the Foundation's resources: legal expertise in historical document cases, relationships with congressional oversight committees, access to specialized authentication technology, and most significantly, a dedicated fund for preserving historically important properties connected to American political history. Mrs. Summerfield, based on the preliminary information available, the documents you discovered may represent one of the most significant Kennedy assassination finds in decades. The Foundation is prepared to designate Summerfield Farm as a historical discovery site of national importance, which would immediately trigger preservation protocols and financial support structures. Eleanor exchanged glances with Julia, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Emmett. May I ask why your organization would take such interest in my situation specifically?" Emmett's expression turned more serious. "Because we've watched too many significant historical materials disappear into government vaults, their insights eventually emerging in sanitized, context-free snippets decades later. The Kennedy assassination has suffered particularly from this pattern of institutional control over evidence. What you've discovered represents a rare opportunity for contemporaneous independent authentication alongside official processes." He paused, his academic reserve giving way to more personal conviction. "And frankly, Mrs. Summerfield, your story resonates powerfully. The independent farmer who discovers evidence challenging official narratives while fighting to save her Pembley land, it embodies core American values about individual citizens' roles in safeguarding historical truth." The conversation continued with Julia asking precise questions about the Foundation's proposed involvement, the legal protections they could offer, and the specific mechanisms for farm preservation. Throughout the discussion, Eleanor was struck by how her personal crisis, the impending farm foreclosure, had become interwoven with broader questions of historical transparency and institutional accountability. As Emmett outlined the Foundation's preliminary preservation plan, Eleanor found herself mentally mapping his professional language onto the physical reality of the farm, this pasture becoming a heritage agricultural demonstration site, the barn housing a small museum about rural document preservation, the farmhouse itself recognized for its connection to a pivotal historical discovery. "We could have funding in place within 72 hours, Emmett concluded, enough to halt the foreclosure proceedings immediately while more permanent arrangements are established." After the call ended, the atmosphere in the farmhouse shifted perceptibly. The National Historical Foundation's involvement represented significant validation and protection, both for the Kennedy documents and for the farm itself. "This changes everything," Julia observed, her legal precision temporarily giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "The Foundation's reputation for integrity is unassailable. Their involvement creates a counterweight to potential government attempts to control the narrative." Throughout the morning, the farmhouse's activity intensified. A digital security expert arrived to establish encrypted communication channels for sharing authentication findings. A preservation architect began assessing the barn's structural needs for potential conversion to a historical exhibit space. Margaret's academic colleagues formed a virtual authentication panel, connecting remotely with the experts gathered at the farm. Shortly before noon, Eleanor stepped outside, needing a moment of solitude amid the growing commotion. The spring air carried the scent of newly turned earth from neighboring farms where planting had begun. Her own fields lay fallow. She had lacked both resources and certainty to invest in this year's crops, another painful consequence of the farm's precarious financial state. She walked toward the oak tree where she had spoken with FBI Director Rayburn the previous evening, its massive branches providing welcome shade. The farm stretched before her, the weathered buildings, the fertile soil, the boundaries marked by trees planted by Summerfield hands generations earlier. This land held more than agricultural value. It contained layers of family history, not just in structures and property lines, but in the accumulated choices and commitments of those who had worked it. "I thought I might find you here," Margaret said, approaching from the house. "When things get overwhelming, sometimes distance provides perspective." Eleanor nodded, grateful for her friend's understanding. "Everything's happening so quickly. Yesterday morning, I was just a widow facing foreclosure. Now there are experts in my kitchen discussing historical preservation grants and authentication protocols. It doesn't seem quite real." Margaret settled beside her on the bench. "Reality often changes more dramatically than we expect. Yesterday, this was a struggling family farm approaching its end. Today, it's potentially a nationally significant historical site. The land hasn't changed, only its meaning and possibilities." "I keep thinking about William Summerfield," Eleanor admitted. "He must have known the risks of keeping those documents when Hoover himself ordered their destruction. Yet something in him couldn't surrender historical truth, even if he wasn't prepared to reveal it publicly." "That's how history often survives," Margaret observed. "Not through grand gestures of defiance, but through quiet acts of preservation. Someone who simply couldn't bring themselves to destroy what they knew might someday matter." Their conversation was interrupted by Michael calling from the porch, his expression conveying urgency. "Mum, you need to see this. They're coming up the road now." Eleanor and Margaret returned to the farmhouse just as a convoy of vehicles appeared on the gravel driveway. Not government SUVs this time, but news vans bearing the logos of major networks. Behind them, a stream of cars suggested that word had spread beyond media circles. "It's beginning," Julia said, joining them at the window. "The story broke on national news 20 minutes ago. These are just the first responders, so to speak." "What do I do?" Eleanor asked, watching as reporters began setting up equipment at the edge of her property. "You have choices," Julia replied. "We can issue written statements only. We can select 1 or 2 respected journalists for controlled interviews, or we can hold a formal press conference with the historical authentication team beside you. Each approach has different implications for how the narrative develops." Eleanor considered her options, watching as more vehicles continued to arrive. Local cars began parking along the county road, their occupants walking toward the farm. Not media, but ordinary citizens drawn by the news reports. She recognized many as neighbors and community members she had known for decades. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "we need to be as transparent as possible, both about the documents and about the farm's situation. If William Summerfield preserved these materials for eventual historical truth, we should honor that intention fully." The decision made, the team mobilized with remarkable efficiency. Michael worked with Julia to establish ground rules for media access. Richard Harrington coordinated with the authentication experts to prepare preliminary findings that could be responsibly shared. Margaret contacted trusted historical colleagues who could provide independent context for the document's significance. By mid-afternoon, the scene at Summerfield Farm had transformed dramatically. The once quiet property now hosted over 100 people, journalists, historians, curious locals, and a growing number of Kennedy assassination researchers who had dropped everything to witness this development firsthand. The weathered front porch that had previously hosted nothing more exciting than Sunday afternoon iced tea now served as an impromptu stage for what would become a historically significant press conference. Eleanor had changed into her one good outfit, the navy blue dress she wore for church and special occasions, paired with her grandmother's simple pearl necklace. As she prepared to address the gathered crowd, she felt strangely calm. The path forward had clarified itself. Complete transparency about the documents combined with preservation of the farm that had protected them for so long. Julia touched her arm gently. "Remember, you don't need to speculate about the document's implications. Simply share what you found, how you found it, and why you believe it matters. The historical team will handle the technical aspects." Eleanor nodded, squared her shoulders, and stepped onto the porch where microphones had been arranged. So, crowd quieted immediately. Cameras focused on this unassuming farm woman, suddenly at the center of a historical revelation. "Good afternoon," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite her lack of experience with public speaking. "My name is Eleanor Summerfield. 3 days ago, while cleaning out our family barn, I discovered documents hidden in my husband's grandfather's desk. Documents that appear to show J. Edgar Hoover personally directing the suppression of witness testimony following the Kennedy assassination." She continued with simple, straightforward clarity, describing the discovery, the initial authentication efforts, and the extraordinary response from both government agencies and historical organizations. She acknowledged the farm's financial difficulties and the foreclosure threat, speaking candidly about how the document's discovery had created unexpected possibilities for preserving both historical truth and the family farm. William Summerfield made a choice decades ago to preserve these records rather than destroy them, as ordered, she concluded. I believe he did so knowing they might someday help complete our understanding of a pivotal moment in American history. The experts here today can address the technical aspects of authentication and historical context, but I wanted to personally emphasize that this discovery belongs not to me, nor to any government agency or private organization, but to our shared historical record as Americans. The response was immediate and powerful. Applause from the gathered crowd, rapid-fire questions from journalists, and visible approval from the historical experts flanking her on the porch. As the authentication team took over, explaining the preliminary findings and the process for complete verification, Eleanor stepped back, suddenly aware of how completely her life had transformed in just 3 days. From the edge of the crowd, she spotted familiar faces. The postal carrier who had delivered mail to the farm for 20 years, the retired teachers who had taught both her and James in the county school, farmers from neighboring properties, who had helped with harvests and machinery repairs over decades. Their presence amid the national media and historical experts provided a grounding reminder that while the documents might have global historical significance, they had been preserved in this specific community by people whose values included both truth and loyalty to place. As the formal presentations concluded and journalists began conducting individual interviews with the historical experts, Eleanor found herself approached by a small group of local farmers, led by Howard Jenkins, whose property adjoined the eastern boundary of the Summerfield farm. "Eleanor," Howard said, removing his cap respectfully, "we've been talking among ourselves since the news broke. The Summerfield place has been part of this community since before most of our families arrived. We're hoping that whatever comes next, you'll make sure it remains connected to the agricultural traditions around here, not just become some sterile historical site." Eleanor was touched by their concern. "That's been on my mind too, Howard. If the farm is preserved, I want it to remain a working landscape, not just a monument." The conversation expanded as more community members joined, offering perspectives on how historical designation might benefit the broader agricultural community through educational programs, heritage crop preservation, and sustainable farming demonstrations. What began as neighbors expressing concern evolved into an impromptu planning session for how Summerfield Farm might serve both historical truth and contemporary rural vitality. As evening approached, the media presence gradually diminished, though a core group of journalists remained for ongoing updates from the authentication team. Eleanor found herself sitting on the porch steps with Michael, watching the interplay of golden sunset light across fields that had suddenly taken on new meaning and possibility. "It's strange," she reflected, "how completely things can change. through a single discovery. 3 days ago, I was measuring my remaining time here in weeks, trying to figure out where I'd go when the bank took the farm. Now we're discussing historical preservation grants and educational programs. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. When I first got the call about government vehicles at the farm, I was terrified something had happened to you. I never imagined they'd be FBI agents responding to historical documents. Your father would have appreciated the irony, Eleanor said with a sad smile. He always said the farm had stories to tell if people just paid attention. I don't think even he could have imagined this particular story, though. Their conversation was interrupted by Julia's approach, her expression suggesting significant news. Eleanor, we've just received word that the Senate Historical Records Committee has called an emergency session regarding the documents. They're invoking special oversight authority for historically significant materials related to presidential investigations. Is that good or bad for us? Eleanor asked, having quickly learned that in matters involving government agencies and historical records, developments could cut in multiple directions. Potentially very positive, Julia replied. It moves primary jurisdiction from the FBI to Congress, where transparency requirements are more stringent. More importantly, it validates the national significance of the discovery, which strengthens our position regarding the farm's historical designation. As this news rippled through the remaining experts and journalists, Eleanor observed a subtle shift in how people regarded the property around them. The weathered barn was no longer just an aging agricultural structure, but the sanctuary that had protected historical evidence for generations. The modest farmhouse represented not just a family home, but a connection point between ordinary rural life and extraordinary historical revelation. The land itself seemed to take on new dimension. Not just acres of soil, but the ground that had sheltered truth until its proper moment of emergence. Later that evening, after most visitors had departed and only the core research team remained, Eleanor found herself again drawn to the barn, where everything had begun. The space looked different now, partially cleared by her original cleaning. Efforts, further reorganized by the authentication team's activities, illuminated by temporary work lights that cast dramatic shadows among the remaining farm implements and stored furniture. The roll-top desk stood where she had discovered it, now cordoned off with preservation tape, its emptied secret compartment a visible reminder of how completely unexpected discoveries can redirect lives and historical understanding. Eleanor ran her hand along its weathered surface, feeling a connection to William Summerfield that transcended their lack of actual acquaintance. "Thank you," she whispered to her husband's grandfather, "for making the harder choice, for preserving what would have been easier to destroy." A sound at the barn door drew her attention. Richard Harrington stood there, his distinguished appearance somewhat softened by obvious fatigue after days of intense work. "I thought I might find you here," he said, echoing Margaret's earlier words. People often return to the point of discovery, trying to recapture that moment of revelation. Eleanor nodded. "I keep thinking about all the times I walked past this desk over the years, never knowing what it contained. How many other secrets are hidden in plain sight around us?" "That's the historian's eternal question," Harrington replied, entering the barn and regarding the desk with professional appreciation. "History isn't just what happened, but what was recorded, what was preserved, what was hidden, and what eventually emerges." William Summerfield couldn't have known that his act of preservation would surface at precisely the moment when it might save his family's farm from foreclosure. Or perhaps he did, in some way, Eleanor suggested, not the specific circumstances, but the general principle that truth preserved creates possibilities that truth destroyed cannot. Harrington regarded her thoughtfully. "For someone who didn't seek this role, you've adapted to it with remarkable wisdom, Mrs. Summerfield." "Farming teaches adaptability," she replied simply, "and recognizing value in unexpected places." As they walked back toward the farmhouse together, the illuminated windows glowing warmly against the deepening dusk, Eleanor felt a profound sense of transition. The farm that had seemed destined for auction and subdivision just days earlier now hummed with renewed purpose. The financial threat remained technically active. No preservation funds had yet been transferred, but the trajectory had shifted dramatically toward conservation rather than loss. What Eleanor Summerfield could not yet fully appreciate, standing on the threshold between her past life and whatever would emerge from this extraordinary discovery, was how completely her definition of value would transform in the coming weeks. The land that she had measured in terms of agricultural productivity would reveal new dimensions of worth, as historical sanctuary, as educational resource, as community heritage, and ultimately as tangible connection between ordinary rural lives and extraordinary moments in national history. The simple woman who had begun the week facing foreclosure and an uncertain future now stood at the center of converging interests. Historical truth, institutional accountability, rural preservation, and community continuity. The documents, hidden decades earlier by a county clerk who couldn't bring himself to destroy them, had emerged at precisely the moment when they might not only clarify historical understanding, but save the very property that had sheltered them for so long. As Eleanor rejoined the team in her farmhouse kitchen, where experts continued analyzing the photographs of documents now in government custody, she recognized that the most meaningful preservation occurring wasn't just of historical papers or even of the physical farm, but of principles that transcended both. The belief that truth matters, that ordinary people can make extraordinary contributions to shared understanding, and that sometimes what seems like the end of a cherished way of life can instead become its unexpected renewal. 6 months after Eleanor Summerfield's discovery in the old roll-top desk, Summerfield Farm presented a transformed landscape, both physically and symbolically. The October morning air carried the crisp promise of fall as Eleanor stood on the restored front porch, watching a tour group follow Margaret Holloway toward the barn that had become the centerpiece of what was now officially designated as the Summerfield Center for Historical Transparency and Rural Heritage. The weathered red barn that had once stored discarded furniture and rusting farm implements now housed a carefully designed exhibition space. Its centerpiece was William Summerfield's roll-top desk, displayed behind conservation glass with an interactive screen nearby showing digitized versions of the Kennedy documents he had preserved. Surrounding this focal point were exhibits exploring rural America's often overlooked role in preserving national history, the complex legacy of the Kennedy assassination investigations, and the 4 generations of Summerfields who had worked this land. Eleanor sipped her coffee from a mug emblazoned with the farm's new logo, a simple roll-top desk partially open to reveal a document bearing the word truth. The design had been created by a local high school student during the community-wide competition to develop the farm's new visual identity. The winning design now appeared on everything from the freshly painted sign at the entrance to the educational materials distributed to visiting students. "Morning, Eleanor," called Howard Jenkins, pulling up in his pickup truck. Like many neighboring farmers, Howard had integrated his agricultural expertise into the farm's new identity, helping develop the heritage farming program that maintained working agricultural operations alongside the historical exhibits. Those heritage wheat varieties are coming up strong in the North Field, should make for a good demonstration during the Harvest Festival next month. Eleanor nodded appreciatively. The decision to maintain active farming operations had been central to her vision for the property's preservation. While the document's discovery had created the opportunity for saving the farm from foreclosure, she had insisted that any preservation plan must honor the land's agricultural heritage rather than transforming it into a static historical monument. "Michael called from Minneapolis," she told Howard as he joined her on the porch. "He's bringing the kids down this weekend to help with the apple harvest in the heritage orchard." The mention of the orchard represented another unexpected dimension of the farm's transformation. Historical research into the property had revealed that the original Summerfield settlers had maintained an impressive collection of apple varieties, many now rare or extinct elsewhere. With funding from agricultural preservation grants, these heritage varieties had been reintroduced, creating both a living genetic bank of historic apples and a popular attraction for visitors interested in sustainable agriculture. Howard nodded with satisfaction. "Those city grandkids of yours need to get their hands in the dirt regularly. Keeps them connected to what matters." As they conversed about the upcoming harvest activities, Eleanor marveled at how completely her circumstances had transformed. The financial crisis that had once threatened to end her connection to this land had been resolved through an innovative combination of historical preservation grants, educational programming funds, and sustainable agriculture initiatives. Summerfield Farm had evolved from a struggling private operation into a multifaceted community resource that honored both its historical significance and agricultural traditions. The Senate Historical Records Committee's involvement had proven decisive in those early weeks following the discovery. Their emergency session had not only secured proper handling of the Kennedy documents, but had established the farm as a case study in rural historical preservation. The resulting legislation had created new funding mechanisms specifically designed to protect properties where historically significant discoveries occurred, recognizing that such sites deserved protection beyond their architectural or aesthetic merits. Ms. Summerfield, a young woman in professional attire, approached the porch, tablet in hand. "I'm Melissa Chen from the National Archives. We have the final preservation report ready for your review before this afternoon's commemoration ceremony." Eleanor smiled warmly. "Of course, Melissa, let's go inside." They entered the farmhouse, which retained its character as a family home while incorporating necessary modifications to support its new educational mission. The kitchen, where Eleanor had once worried over unpaid bills, now featured a large farm table where visiting scholars, agricultural students, and historical researchers gathered for meals prepared using heritage recipes and produce from the farm's fields. Melissa laid out the comprehensive preservation report, detailing the final authentication findings regarding the Kennedy documents and their historical context. The papers had indeed proven genuine. J. Edgar Hoover's handwritten directives to suppress certain witness testimonies had been confirmed through extensive forensic analysis, handwriting comparison, and contextual research. More significantly, the discovery had prompted the release of previously classified files that corroborated William Summerfield's hidden cache, creating a more complete picture of how the official Kennedy assassination narrative had been carefully constructed. The commemorative display will be installed in the National Archives East Wing next month, Melissa explained, showing Eleanor digital renderings of the exhibit. It features a full-scale reproduction of the Summerfield barn interior, with the roll-top desk as the centerpiece. Visitors will experience the discovery moment as you did, then follow the authentication journey through interactive displays. Eleanor studied the designs with a mixture of appreciation and disbelief. The idea that her ordinary morning cleaning the barn would be recreated in the National Archives seemed surreal, yet it represented a powerful message about how historical understanding often advances, not through dramatic revelations, but through quiet persistence and unexpected discoveries in overlooked places. "They've captured it beautifully," she acknowledged, "though I'm sure the reproduction barn will be considerably cleaner than ours was that morning." As Melissa continued outlining the commemoration plans, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the many unforeseen consequences of her discovery. Beyond saving the farm itself, the Kennedy documents had triggered a broader reassessment of how historical records were preserved and accessed, particularly in rural communities. The Summerfield Initiative, as it had become known in historical preservation circles, had established new protocols for documenting and protecting potential historical materials in aging rural properties facing economic pressures. More personally, Eleanor had discovered capacities within herself she had never recognized. The woman who had once focused solely on maintaining the farm's day-to-day operations had become an eloquent advocate for rural historical preservation, testifying before congressional committees, consulting with university agricultural programs, and mentoring other farm owners facing similar challenges. The quiet widow facing foreclosure had transformed into a respected voice on the intersection of agricultural heritage and historical transparency. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Richard Harrington, the Kennedy researcher whose expertise had proven invaluable during the authentication process. Now, in his late 70s, Harrington had become a regular presence at the farm, serving as the primary historical consultant for the educational programs. "The documentary crew is setting up in the barn," he reported, accepting the coffee Eleanor offered. "They want to capture some footage before the visitors arrive for the ceremony." The documentary, produced by a respected historical filmmaker and scheduled to air on public television the following month, represented another unexpected dimension of the farm's new identity. Keepers of Secrets, Rural America's Hidden Histories, explored how ordinary agricultural communities often preserved historical materials through generations, their distance from centers of power sometimes enabling the survival of documents that might otherwise have been purged from official records. "I'm still not entirely comfortable with all this attention," Eleanor admitted as they walked toward the barn. "I keep telling people I just found the papers. William Summerfield was the one who made the brave choice to preserve them." Harrington smiled knowingly. "That's true, but you made equally important choices, Eleanor. When powerful institutions pressured you to surrender control of the documents and the narrative, you insisted on transparency. When financial salvation was offered in exchange for discretion, you chose the harder path. Those decisions were no less significant than William's original act of preservation." The observation gave Eleanor pause. She had never framed her actions in terms of courage or significance, viewing them instead as simple adherence to the straightforward values James had exemplified throughout their life together. Yet Harrington's perspective helped explain why her story had resonated so powerfully beyond the historical significance of the documents themselves. As they entered the barn, now transformed into a state-of-the-art exhibition space while maintaining its agricultural character, Eleanor was struck by how many people were already gathered for the afternoon's commemoration ceremony. The documentary crew adjusted lighting around the central display of William Summerfield's desk. University students from the agricultural history program set up demonstrations of heritage farming techniques. Local community members arranged refreshments featuring crops grown in the farm's fields. Most moving to Eleanor was the presence of so many neighbors, farmers who had initially viewed the farm's transformation with skepticism but had gradually become enthusiastic participants in its new mission. Howard Jenkins now led the Heritage Wheat program, sharing traditional growing methods with visiting agricultural students. Mabel Wilson from the adjacent dairy farm had developed an educational program on rural women's historical contributions to agricultural innovation. Even Frank Peterson, the most traditional of the county's farmers, had become an unlikely champion for preserving agricultural records, donating his family's farm journals dating back to the 1880s to the farm's growing archive. "Mrs. Summerfield," called Julia Winters, who had arrived for the commemoration ceremony. The attorney's formal demeanor had softened over the months of working together, evolving into genuine friendship. "The Senate Historical Committee representatives have arrived. They've brought something they thought you should see before the public ceremony." Julia led Eleanor to a quiet corner of the exhibition space where two distinguished-looking individuals waited with a document case. "Mrs. Summerfield, I'm Senator Diane Hartwell, chair of the Historical Records Committee. This is Dr. James Barkley, the archivist of the United States. We wanted to personally deliver this in advance of today's public announcement." Dr. Barkley opened the document case to reveal an official presidential proclamation, its formal language and gold seal conveying immediate significance. "As of this morning," he explained, "the President has signed an executive order establishing the American Rural Heritage Preservation Initiative, with Summerfield Farm designated as its inaugural site. The program allocates substantial federal funding for identifying and preserving historically significant rural properties, particularly those containing potential documentary evidence of national importance." Eleanor accepted the proclamation with hands that trembled slightly. "This goes far beyond our farm," she observed, scanning the document's contents. "This could help preserve rural historical sites across the country." "That's precisely the point," Senator Hartwell confirmed. "Your discovery demonstrated a critical gap in our historical preservation framework. Rural properties often preserve important historical materials precisely because they remain in the same family for generations, outside the purview of institutional control. This initiative creates mechanisms for identifying and protecting such sites before economic pressures lead to their loss." As the senator outlined the initiative's scope, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable chain of consequences flowing from that ordinary April morning. What had begun as a desperate attempt to sort through accumulated possessions before losing the farm had catalyzed national policy changes that would help preserve countless other rural properties and their historical contents. By mid-afternoon, the barn was filled to capacity for the official commemoration ceremony. Local residents sat alongside historians, government officials, journalists, and agricultural preservation advocates. The atmosphere blended academic formality with rural warmth. Scholarly presentations followed by communal sharing of food, harvested from the farm's fields, official proclamations alongside farmers trading cultivation tips. When the time came for Eleanor to speak, she approached the podium, feeling a familiar mixture of discomfort with public attention and deep commitment to the farm's new mission. The weathered hands that had once focused exclusively on agricultural tasks now held notes for an address that would be broadcast beyond this gathering to audiences interested in historical preservation nationwide. "6 months ago," she began, "I was cleaning out this barn because I expected to lose this farm to foreclosure. The documents I found that day in William Summerfield's desk changed not just my circumstances, but my understanding of how history survives and eventually emerges. What I've come to recognize is that historical preservation isn't just the work of institutions and experts, though we're deeply grateful for their knowledge and support. It's also the accumulated choices of ordinary people who recognize value worth protecting, even when that value isn't obvious to others." Eleanor gestured toward the exhibition panels that lined the barn's interior, showcasing not just the Kennedy documents, but the broader history of the farm and the community it had sustained. "This land has been in the Summerfield family for 4 generations. Each generation preserved something of value for the next: agricultural knowledge, building craftsmanship, community connections, and in William Summerfield's case, historical documents that others wanted destroyed. What matters isn't just what was preserved, but the commitment to stewardship that motivated that preservation. As she continued her remarks, Eleanor observed the diverse audience before her. Academics nodding at her insights about historical continuity, local farmers appreciating her emphasis on agricultural heritage, government officials recognizing the policy implications of her experience. The woman who had once defined herself primarily as James Summerfield's widow and a struggling farmer had found a new voice that connected rural wisdom with national historical concerns. The Kennedy documents themselves are obviously historically significant, she acknowledged, but I believe there's equal significance in where they were preserved, not in an institutional archive, but in a rural farming community, protected by generations who understood that sometimes value must be measured across decades rather than immediate utility. Rural America has always preserved more than crops and livestock. It has maintained ways of seeing and valuing that sometimes offer necessary corrections to institutional perspectives. After the formal ceremony concluded, the gathering transitioned to a community celebration on the farmhouse lawn. Tables laden with food, prepared from the farm's heritage crops, created a tangible connection between historical preservation and sustainable agricultural practices. University agricultural students demonstrated heritage farming techniques to interested visitors. Local musicians played traditional songs that had accompanied harvests and barn raisings for generations. As sunset approached, casting golden light across the property that had so nearly been lost, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone on the porch steps. From this vantage point, she could see the full scope of the transformation: the carefully restored barn with its historical exhibits, the heritage orchard where rare apple varieties again flourished, the demonstration fields where traditional farming methods maintained crops once common but now nearly forgotten. Michael joined her, handing her a glass of cider pressed from the farm's first heritage apple harvest. "You've created something remarkable here, Mom," he observed, surveying the gathered community. "It's so much more than just preserving the farm." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "I didn't create this. It emerged from circumstances none of us controlled. William Summerfield preserved those documents decades before any of us could know their significance. The farm itself preserved agricultural traditions that suddenly have new value in an era of industrial farming. I was just fortunate enough to be here when these elements converged." "That's true," Michael acknowledged, "but not everyone would have made the choices you did when discovery brought both opportunity and pressure. You could have quietly accepted the FBI's offer to solve your financial problems in exchange for allowing them to control the documents. You could have sold the farm once its historical value was established. Instead, you insisted on both transparency and continued agricultural purpose." His observation echoed Harrington's earlier perspective, helping Eleanor recognize that while the initial discovery may have been serendipitous, the path that followed had been shaped by choices reflecting her deepest values. Perhaps that explained why the farm's transformation had felt organic, despite its dramatic scope. It represented not an abandonment of its agricultural heritage, but an expansion of how that heritage could serve both the local community and national historical understanding. As darkness fell and lanterns illuminated the gathering, Eleanor watched the seamless interaction of groups that might once have seemed irreconcilable: academic historians and local farmers, government officials, and rural community members, agricultural students, and historical researchers. The Summerfield farm had become not just a physical space where history was preserved, but a conceptual bridge connecting different approaches to valuing the past and imagining the future. Director Rayburn appeared at her side, his presence at the ceremony a surprising but welcome development. The FBI's initial approach had evolved substantially in the months following the discovery, shifting from attempted control to collaborative authentication under congressional oversight. "Congratulations, Mrs. Summerfield," he offered. "Few people have the opportunity to witness such complete vindication of their principles." Eleanor considered his choice of words. "I never thought of it as vindication, Director Rayburn, just as necessary transparency about our shared history." "That perspective is precisely why this has become more than a historical footnote," Rayburn observed. "Your insistence that historical truth belongs neither to government institutions nor private interests, but to the public understanding, has established an important precedent for future discoveries." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Senator Hartwell, who joined them with news that the Rural Heritage Preservation Initiative had already identified 17 potentially significant properties in 6 states. The Summerfield model, as we're calling it, provides a framework for supporting these properties before economic pressures force choices between preservation and survival. As the evening progressed and visitors gradually departed, Eleanor found herself again drawn to the barn where everything had begun. The space that had once represented the accumulated debris of generations had been transformed into a living connection between past and future. William Summerfield's desk stood at its center, no longer merely an antique piece of furniture, but a symbol of how ordinary objects in overlooked places sometimes preserve extraordinary truths. Eleanor ran her hand along the desk's weathered surface, feeling a profound connection to the county clerk who had made the quiet but consequential decision to preserve documents others wanted destroyed. She hadn't known William Summerfield in life, but through his preservation choice and her discovery, they had become partners across time in service to historical transparency. The simple woman who had faced foreclosure 6 months earlier now stood as steward not just of a revitalized farm, but of an emerging understanding about rural America's role in preserving national history. The documents hidden decades earlier had not only illuminated a contested historical moment, but had catalyzed recognition that historical truth often survives in unexpected places. In the barns and attics of family farms, in the collected papers of county officials, in the unassuming spaces overlooked by institutional power. As Eleanor prepared to close the barn for the evening, Margaret Holloway joined her, the historian's academic expertise now complemented by 6 months of direct engagement with the farm's evolving mission. "I've been thinking about why this particular discovery resonated so powerfully beyond historical circles," Margaret reflected. "It's not just about Kennedy or Hoover or even governmental transparency. It's about recognizing that sometimes ordinary people in overlooked places make choices that eventually prove extraordinary in their consequences." Eleanor nodded, finding in Margaret's observation an articulation of what she had felt but struggled to express. William Summerfield couldn't have known how his decision would matter generations later. He just knew he couldn't bring himself to destroy something that might eventually serve truth. And you couldn't bring yourself to surrender control of that truth, even when doing so might have solved your immediate problems more easily, Margaret added. That's the pattern that matters here. Not just the content of the documents, but the chain of ordinary individuals making principled choices, without certainty about their eventual impact. As they walked together toward the farmhouse, now glowing with warm light against the October darkness, Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness about the farm's transformation. The land that had sustained generations of Summerfields continued to do so, not just through agricultural production, but through a broader understanding of cultivation. growing crops alongside historical awareness, nurturing both plants and principles, harvesting food alongside truth. What had begun in desperation, a widow facing foreclosure, desperately sorting through accumulated possessions, had evolved into something none could have predicted. The documents preserved by William Summerfield had not only illuminated a contested moment in American history, but had created the possibility for a new chapter in rural preservation, demonstrating how agricultural heritage and historical transparency could reinforce rather than compete with each other. The FBI director's unexpected visit to the farm that spring day had marked a critical juncture, presenting Eleanor with a choice between immediate financial salvation through discretion or a more challenging path, prioritizing historical transparency. Her decision to pursue the harder course had established a template for how historically significant discoveries in rural settings might be handled, with respect for both the physical land and the historical truth it had preserved. As Eleanor Summerfield looked out over the farm that would now remain in her care for the rest of her life, she understood that its greatest crop had never been the wheat or corn cultivated in its fields, but the commitment to principled stewardship that had guided generations of its caretakers. William Summerfield had preserved documents others wanted destroyed. She had insisted on transparency when powerful institutions preferred discretion. Together, their choices across time had not only saved a family farm from foreclosure, but had created a new model for how rural heritage and historical truth might together cultivate a more complete understanding of America's complex past. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.